start with 5 names. Spain, the reigning world champions fresh off lifting the trophy. France, England, Germany, and Italy. 5 of the biggest, wealthiest, and most successful football nations on the planet. And every one of them has now delivered the exact same message to FIFA. We will not take part in the 2030 World Cup. This isn't a bluff. It isn't a bargaining tactic. It's an official position. And here's the part that should have Gianni Infantino deeply concerned. Those 5 countries aren't the entire list. They're only the first 5 names out of 55. Because this isn't a handful of nations threatening to leave the World Cup. It's the whole of Europe. Every UEFA member association, all 55 of them, gathered in one meeting and unanimously backed the same decision. So what exactly did FIFA do to convince the most influential confederation in football that the World Cup itself was no longer worth attending? Let me explain, because somehow the full story is even more shocking than it first appears. On Tuesday, Infantino introduced a proposal. Not a rumor, not a leaked document. A formal plan. FIFA wants to separate the commercial rights of the World Cup and every major competition it controls into a brand new company called FIFA Forward Enterprise. Then it plans to sell roughly 20% of that company to private investors in a deal reportedly worth around $20 billion. Think about that for a second. FIFA wants private equity to own part of the World Cup. And it becomes even more controversial because the investment group expected to lead the deal is linked to Joshua Kushner, founder of Thrive Capital. If that last name sounds familiar, it should. Joshua Kushner is the brother of Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of the President of the United States. So when you remove all the polished corporate language, here's what FIFA is really proposing. The biggest sporting event on Earth, built over generations by players and supporters across every continent, could end up partly owned by a private investment fund connected to the White House. You can imagine why that immediately raised eyebrows. FIFA naturally didn't describe it that way. Infantino presented it as an opportunity. According to him, approving the proposal would unlock huge financial rewards for all 211 member associations. FIFA claimed every federation could receive more than $80 million over the next decade, while development funding for smaller nations would increase dramatically. Big money for everyone willing to vote yes. But there was another detail that immediately caused concern. The deadline, September 19th. Just over 6 weeks to approve selling part of the World Cup's commercial future forever. Reports suggest the confederations weren't consulted beforehand. FIFA simply announced the proposal and expected everyone else to approve it. And more than the money, more than the Kushner connection, that was the spark that ignited everything. Football's governing bodies rarely react well when major decisions arrive without consultation and are presented as if they're already settled. UEFA reacted first, and it reacted forcefully. On Thursday, European football's governing body called an emergency virtual meeting involving all 55 member associations. Reports indicate more than 50 federations spoke during the discussion, and by the end the outcome was unanimous. Europe would boycott not only the 2030 World Cup but every FIFA competition for as long as the proposal remained active. They also demanded FIFA permanently guarantee that its tournaments would never again be open to private ownership. UEFA summed up its position with one sentence. The World Cup cannot be treated as an investment product. That sentence captures the entire conflict. To Infantino, the World Cup appears to be a financial asset with a market value that can be divided and partially sold. To the people who play the game and the fans who fill stadiums around the world, it isn't something that belongs on the market. It never was. And this week, many of football's most powerful voices reminded FIFA exactly who they believe the World Cup truly belongs to. Think about what a European boycott would actually mean. This isn't symbolic. Remove Spain, France, England, Germany, Italy, Portugal, the Netherlands, Croatia, and dozens of other European nations, and what remains is no longer the tournament fans recognize as the World Cup. It becomes a very different competition carrying the same name. The tournament Infantino hopes investors will value at billions immediately loses much of that value if Europe refuses to participate. Suddenly those shares aren't tied to football's greatest event anymore. They're tied to something far less prestigious. And the consequences wouldn't even begin in 2030. FIFA's next major tournaments include the 2027 Women's World Cup in Brazil, along with several youth and women's competitions before then. That means the first practical impact of Europe's boycott would fall on women's football and youth tournaments. The earliest people affected wouldn't be the officials making decisions. They would be young players and women who had absolutely nothing to do with the dispute. Critics already have a description for that scenario: turning women's football into a bargaining chip. And it's not an accusation FIFA wants attached to its name. Then the situation expanded even further. This wasn't simply Europe expressing frustration. CONCACAF, representing North America, Central America, and the Caribbean, including the United States, Canada, and Mexico, held its own emergency discussions and rejected the proposal as well. They stopped short of announcing a boycott, but they strongly criticized the process itself, questioning the lack of consultation, the rushed timetable, and what they viewed as poor governance. The U.S. Soccer Federation publicly supported that position. Shortly afterward, Asia responded too. The AFC, representing 47 member associations and traditionally considered one of Infantino's strongest areas of support, released a statement backing UEFA and CONCACAF while demanding an urgent review of FIFA's decision-making process. Add the numbers together: 55 UEFA members, 41 from CONCACAF, and 47 from Asia. That's 143 out of FIFA's 211 associations opposing the proposal. Infantino needs majority support for approval. Based on those numbers alone, the proposal isn't merely struggling. It appears defeated before the vote has even happened. Then came another major development. Carlos Cordero, one of Infantino's senior advisors and FIFA's representative on the White House task force for the 2026 World Cup, resigned in protest. He even encouraged other senior officials to speak publicly if they shared similar concerns. Suddenly, conversations began about something almost nobody expected just days earlier: a genuine challenger to Infantino in the next FIFA presidential election. Until now, many believed he would cruise toward another uncontested victory. If all of this sounds strangely familiar, there's a reason. This follows a recognizable pattern. Infantino previously promoted the idea of holding the World Cup every 2 years in 2021, a proposal Europe also threatened to boycott. He's the same president who expanded the Men's World Cup to 48 teams and has even discussed increasing it to 64 by 2030. Time after time, enormous ideas emerge from the top with little warning before the football world is expected to react. Sometimes those ideas survive. This one clearly hasn't. Now let's be fair for a moment, because every story deserves both sides. FIFA argues the money generated from this proposal would be reinvested throughout football, helping smaller federations that genuinely need financial support rather than relying on wealthy domestic leagues like the Premier League or La Liga. Infantino described it as an option rather than an obligation. FIFA also rejected claims that football itself was being sold. And objectively speaking, private investment has already transformed sports around the world. In many cases, that money has helped improve clubs, leagues, and infrastructure. It's also fair to ask whether some of Europe's richest football associations are defending principles or protecting their own influence over the global game. That's a reasonable question, and one worth considering. There is a legitimate conversation about how football should finance its future and distribute its wealth more fairly. That debate absolutely deserves attention. But according to FIFA's critics, that isn't why this proposal collapsed. They argue it failed because FIFA is already sitting on record financial reserves following the most profitable World Cup ever staged and still decided to seek outside investors. They argue it failed because a $20 billion restructuring involving the sport's biggest tournament was introduced with only 6 weeks for approval and without first consulting the confederations. The biggest issue wasn't simply what FIFA wanted to do. It was how it tried to do it. Quickly, quietly, and without meaningful discussion. And this time the football world pushed back together. At its heart, that's what this entire controversy is really about. The World Cup doesn't belong to Gianni Infantino. It doesn't belong to FIFA executives behind closed doors. And many believe it certainly shouldn't belong to private equity investors either. It belongs to the supporters who travel across continents, the smaller nations dreaming of qualification, and the players who dedicate their careers to reaching football's biggest stage. FIFA's responsibility is to protect that competition, not redefine who owns part of it. This week, many of its own members believed that responsibility had been crossed. Infantino appeared to believe the financial incentives would be enough to secure approval. Instead, more than 140 member associations challenged the proposal, senior advisors began resigning, and the project now looks close to collapse before the official vote even arrives. Whether FIFA withdraws the proposal, fights to save it, or faces even greater political consequences will be the story everyone watches over the coming weeks. So now the question goes to you. Was this simply an ambitious proposal that FIFA completely miscalculated? Or are we witnessing one of the biggest political own goals in football history? Share your opinion in the comments because I genuinely like to know where you stand. And if you want to follow everything that happens before the September deadline and see whether Infantino changes course or stands his ground, make sure you subscribe because this story is far from over.